13 real and truly terrifying night driving stories. Story 1. This happened when I was in my early 20s, around 2003, and at the time, I worked as a taxi driver, a job I'd been doing for several years while finishing my studies. I mostly worked the night shift because it was the only way to fit it into my schedule. After dropping off my last passenger, I started heading home. There was a new housing development along my route. I'd passed by it several times before and could tell, from the size of the unfinished homes, that a lot of money was being invested in the area. During the day, the place was filled with construction workers and landscapers, but at almost 2 a.m., the only things left were piles of wood and idle machinery like bulldozers and excavators. The neighborhood bordered a forest, another sign it was meant to be a high-class development. As I slowly drove through the construction site, I got an eerie feeling. There was a sign that read, "Slow down for workers." I wasn't sure if it applied in the middle of the night, but I couldn't risk a fine, so I followed it anyway. As I passed a large dump truck, my headlights illuminated the figure of a man. I didn't have time to react before he ran toward my window, looking absolutely terrified. I quickly locked my doors and ensured all my windows were closed as he approached the driver's side. The man appeared to be in his 40s, clean-shaven, wearing a flannel shirt, blue jeans, and sneakers. He looked like an ordinary guy, except for the fact that he was utterly terrified, tears streaming down his face, his entire body trembling. He stood by my car, his muffled words unintelligible through the closed windows. Maybe I should have driven away, but for some reason, I decided to hear him out. I cracked my window just enough to hear him. "Please, sir, please let me in. I have money," he begged. "Is there someone I can call for you?" I offered. "There's no time." "He's coming," the man pleaded. "Who's coming?" I asked, confused. "Please, sir, there's no time to explain," he cried. By this point, I was more than a little scared. Part of me wanted to help him. But being alone in such an isolated area, his desperation to get into the car worried me. Most taxi drivers have stories about passengers they regret picking up. Unfortunately, assaults do happen in this line of work. I decided not to let him in. "Wait, I'll call the police for you," I told him. "No, there's no time. Please," he screamed. As I drove away, I could hear him shouting, "Please," as he ran after my car. My heart was torn as I heard his cries. I drove straight to the police station and reported what had happened. They told me to go home and said they'd send someone to check the area. I did as they said. After a sleepless night, I called the station to check if they had found him. They told me they'd sent 2 patrol cars to the site, but hadn't found anything. I felt somewhat relieved, hoping he had found another ride. Perhaps my suspicions were correct, and he had bad intentions. A few days later, I was watching the news. There was a report about a body found in a forest where I'd encountered the man. They showed a photo of the victim. It was him, the man who had begged for my hut that night. The reporter said the cause of death was an animal attack, but I don't believe it. There weren't any animals in that forest larger than a raccoon. Besides, I distinctly remember him saying, "He's coming after me." If it were an animal, he wouldn't have said that. It's been difficult dealing with the guilt of turning my back on someone in need. I think many people would be understanding of the decision I made that night, but it's still hard. There are so many unanswered questions, though. Who was he running from? Why was he being chased? And most terrifying of all, whatever it was, could it still be out there? Story 2. This is a true story that happened in September 2020. I was on a trip to Germany, where most of my family and friends live, aside from those in the state of Hidalgo. Not to brag, but my family is extremely wealthy, much more than I can even convey. In fact, my uncle is a billionaire to this day. Because of this, I had my own supercar in Germany, a 2020 Lamborghini Aventador SV. I also own a car in Mexico. My cousins, who also had a great deal of money, were in Germany at the time. We decided to take a drive on the German Autobahn with our supercars. For those who don't know, The Autobahn is a highway in Germany with no speed limit. The group consisted of me and my cousins David, Lucas, and Santiago. David had a Ferrari SF90. Lucas was driving his Porsche 918, and Santiago was in his McLaren 720S. We started our drive at 8 p.m., and before we knew it, we were going well over 260 kilometers per hour. I was having fun when I noticed something strange. David was no longer with the group. I looked around to make sure I wasn't mistaken, but to my horror, I wasn't. David had truly disappeared. I called my other cousins and told them to pull over. When I explained what had happened, they were just as confused and horrified as I was, because there was no way David could have disappeared so abruptly while driving at 250 kilometers per hour. I tried calling him, but he didn't answer. We decided to do something that could have easily gotten us fined. We turned around and drove the wrong way down the highway to look for David. When we reached the section of the road where David had last been seen, we parked our cars and began searching the forest along the Autobahn. It wasn't even 3 minutes before I heard someone screaming for help. It was David's voice. We ran toward the direction of the voice, only to realize something that still chills me to the bone every time I think about it. As we ran, the cries for help stayed at the same distance, as though David, or whatever was pretending to be him, was moving away from us while shouting for help. We began to panic and cry in frustration. We searched and searched, but we couldn't find him. With tears in our eyes, we called Lucas's parents, who were just as terrified as we were. They contacted the police, and we waited until they arrived. A massive search team was organized and lasted 3 days, eventually leading to the discovery of David's Ferrari. What was peculiar was that the car showed no signs of being involved in an accident. It was completely intact, not a scratch, and nothing was missing inside, except for David. The search continued, but without success. After a year, the case was closed because no one could understand how something like this could happen, unless it was some kind of glitch in the Matrix or something similar. It's now 2022, and I still miss and cry for my dear cousin. His car was returned to us, and sometimes I drive it. I still hold on to the hope that somehow he's okay, or at least alive, and that he can be found. This incident has chilled me to the core. Story 3. This is a puzzling story that happened a few years ago. I was driving home from a friend's house. I lived in the countryside, so I often drove into town to hang out with friends. I don't remember exactly what we were doing that night, but we often went to bowling alleys, the movies, or just grabbed ice cream and hung out at the park. What I do remember is that we lost track of time, and it was already after midnight when I started driving home. My house was about 5 kilometers off the main road, meaning 5 kilometers of unlit dirt roads, so driving at night could be a little creepy. It's amazing how dark it gets. So dark that you can't even see your hand in front of your face if the lights go out. Because of that, I always drove slowly in the dark, since you could only see about 5 or 6 meters ahead. This gave me extra time to stop for a deer or avoid a pothole. Not many people lived around there, so I was surprised to see a man walking along the side of the road. I was about 800 meters from the highway at the time, and my headlights illuminated his body as he stood there, waving at me with a friendly smile on his face. He was a large man, tall and stocky, with a mustache and an old baseball cap. If I had to guess, I'd say he was in his mid-30s. I know alarm bells should have gone off in my head, but he didn't seem threatening. Plus, living in the countryside tends to encourage people to help one another, so maybe that's why I trusted him so easily. I slowed down, and he approached the driver's side window as I stopped. "How's it going, ma'am? I'm really sorry to bother you, but could you give me a ride to town?" he said. I didn't even hesitate and agreed. "Sure, hop in," I said. "Thank you so much. I really appreciate it." "My name's Ricky," he said gratefully. "You're welcome, Ricky." "I'm Samantha," I replied. As naive as it sounds, he was so polite that I couldn't help but trust him. I turned the car around and headed back toward the highway. Like I said, we were only about half a kilometer away, so giving him a ride wasn't a big deal. We made small talk for a few minutes. His calm demeanor put me at ease, even though I was alone in the car with a stranger. However, after no more than 10 minutes, he said, "I'm really sorry to do this, ma'am, but I'm going to need to take your car." I had to pause to process what I was hearing. "What are you talking about?" I asked, pleading. Like I said, "I need to take the car." "Let's not make this difficult," he said. I sat there stunned in disbelief. I was about to give him a piece of my mind when he pulled out a gun and pointed it directly at me. My heart almost stopped as I looked at him. He had an expression of regret on his face, like he truly felt bad about what he was doing. I brought the car to a stop and got out. Ricky got into the driver's seat and looked at me. "One last thing, ma'am. I'm going to need your phone. I can't have you calling the cops," he explained. I didn't say a word. I just handed him my phone, my whole body trembling. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry," he said before driving off into the night. I walked for about 30 minutes before managing to flag down a police car. I told them what had happened as we drove to the station to file a report. The officer told me my description matched that of a man wanted for several armed robberies in this and neighboring towns. It was incredible. He had been waiting for someone to pass by on that road, ready to take advantage of their goodwill. I was that unlucky person. It really messed with my mind that someone so polite and kind could turn on me in an instant. I've always been someone who tries to help others, but this made me question my entire worldview. Why should I take a risk for someone who might want to harm me? That's a decision everyone has to make for themselves. I don't want to give up on the world or anything, but it's something to think about. Stay safe out there and look out for yourselves and each other. Story 4. Another day, I got off work around 11 p.m. I was working at a fast food restaurant on the other side of town from where I lived. It was about a 45-minute drive, pretty long for minimum wage, but I couldn't find anything else, so I stuck with it. It started raining around 10 p.m. So when I got off work at 11, the roads were very wet and slippery. I drove slowly during the first half of my drive. Visibility was poor due to the rain, and I was driving through a somewhat rural part of town. I was on a paved road, but most of the turns led to the countryside, where the roads were unpaved. After a while, I noticed there weren't many cars on the road, so I started driving a bit faster. I know it wasn't smart, but I was tired and eager to get home, so I could go to sleep. Suddenly, I noticed a pair of red brake lights ahead of me. I was approaching quickly, so I slammed on the brakes, but it was too late. I rear-ended a car, hitting its back fender as it was trying to make a turn onto one of the country roads. I immediately knew I had messed up. The car had stopped abruptly, but it's pretty well known that if you rear-end someone, it's automatically your fault. Fortunately, I wasn't hurt because I managed to slow down enough before the impact. What was really going through my mind, though, was how much this was going to cost me since I wasn't making much money at the time. I parked my car on the side of the road and turned off the engine. Then I wiped a tear from my cheek before stepping out of my car. First, I checked the damage to my car. There was a broken headlight and a big dent. I was sure it would cost a few $100s to fix, at least, but it could have been worse. Then I turned my attention to the other car, which had stopped ahead of me. The other driver hadn't stepped out yet, so I waited between the two cars. The rain was still falling. I expected to be yelled at and felt I deserved it. After another 30 seconds, the front door of the other car opened and a man stepped out. He was an average-looking guy, probably in his 40s, wearing a gray hoodie and blue jeans. I also noticed a gun on his waistband as he bent over. It wasn't a big deal where I live since many people carry firearms, but it added tension to the situation. I had no idea how he would react. He walked to the back of his car to assess the damage. It was about the same as my car's, a broken taillight and a big dent. Then he looked up and approached me. I could see a small trickle of blood running down his face, definitely caused by the accident. That's when I knew I had really messed up. "Looks like just a scratch. Don't worry about it, buddy," he said. "Are you sure? Did you notice you're bleeding?" I replied, "Yeah, that's from something else." "Just go," he said. I was young, but I knew that if someone was injured in an accident, it had to be reported to the police. Any trouble I was in would be much worse if I didn't report it. So I told the guy, I'm going to call the police. It was my fault. I don't remember exactly what he said next, but he tried to convince me not to report the accident. However, I was persistent and pulled out my phone to dial 911. That's when his demeanor changed. He got angry and started walking toward me. He wasn't doing anything openly threatening, but he was really invading my personal space. It was like a show of dominance, combined with the fact that he was armed, and it seriously intimidated me. I quickly agreed not to call and put my phone back in my pocket. The guy immediately backed off, then turned around and went back to his car. I stood there for a minute, still shaken by what had happened. However, just as the man was driving off, I had enough presence of mind to memorize his license plate. I won't say what it was, but I repeated it in my head several times before it disappeared into the distance. I then got back into my car and called the police. I told them what had happened, that I had been in a car accident where the other driver was injured, but had refused to involve the police. They seemed to take the situation very seriously, and when I gave them the license plate number, they ran it through their system. It turned out the car had been stolen a few days earlier. Not only that, but it had been used in an armed robbery since then. I finally understood why the man didn't want to call the police. They asked me to come to the station and provide a description of the man. It was past midnight when I got there, and I was exhausted, but I knew how important it was to get that guy off the streets. So I went. I did everything I could to help with the investigation. I later heard they caught him and charged him with several crimes. The damage to my car was around 20,000 pesos, which I paid out of pocket, and I was never held liable for the damage to the other car, though I suppose a legitimate owner could have come after me for it. Either way, the money isn't what's important. That man was truly dangerous. And if I had been more persistent about calling the police while he was still there, I have no doubt he would have done something. Story 5. Something really terrifying happened to me when I was about 18 years old in the early 1990s. Back then, I loved cars and enjoyed working on them, even though I was a girl. I had a 1979 Camaro Z28 with T-tops, and during the summer, I often cruised around with my friends looking for something to do. One night, while driving up and down the main street in a neighboring town, I noticed a small red truck following us at a distance. I was with my friend Jenny, and I mentioned that I thought the truck was tailing us. I pulled into a fast food restaurant parking lot and noticed the truck pulling 3 cars behind us. I drove out in the other direction, and once again the truck followed. I repeated this several times, pulling into different lots, and each time the truck followed, keeping 3 cars away. Jenny and I decided it was best to start heading home, which was about 30 minutes away. We thought the truck would give up and stop following us, but it didn't. It stayed behind us. It was getting late, and we were starting to get really worried because the truck had been tailing us for almost an hour. We didn't want to go home and let it follow us there, so I decided it would be best to drive to the nearest police station. I told Jenny my plan, and to my horror, she grabbed the steering wheel and jerked it, causing the car to swerve sharply to the right. "What are you doing?" I yelled. "You're going to make us crash." It was bad enough worrying about the truck following us, but now I had to deal with my panicked passenger potentially causing an accident. "We can't go to the police," she insisted. Then I realized she somehow thought we were at fault, that just by driving around aimlessly, we had done something to provoke this. Reluctantly, I drove away from the police station. We approached a bridge and stopped at a red light on a one-way street. The truck was directly behind the car next to us. The other car turned right, allowing the truck to pull up beside us. I looked over and was shocked to see the driver had stepped out of his truck and was standing next to the passenger side door of my car, without pants. This man didn't just have his pants pulled down to his ankles. He didn't have any on at all. I had the disturbing realization that he probably hadn't had pants on the entire time he had been following us. I floored the gas pedal and ran the red light, speeding across the bridge. Somehow, my friend hadn't noticed him by her window. When I told her, she kept saying, "No way." I drove up and down a few more streets before heading out to the countryside. The truck continued to follow us for what felt like forever until we finally managed to lose him by driving really fast in the middle of nowhere. We went home and tried to forget about it. For some reason, I never told my parents, and I'm not sure why. A few weeks later, I saw on the news that the police were looking for a man in a small red truck. They showed his photo, and he looked just like the man who had followed us. I thought the description of the truck was slightly different from what we saw, but maybe it wasn't. I've always wondered if it was him, and I think it was. Story 6. I was 16 at the time of this event. My close friend Sheila and I were driving back home after visiting some distant relatives in the state of Chiapas, Mexico. Back then, I lived in Ciudad Juarez. It was 11 p.m. and we were the only ones on the road. I had never taken this route before, but I wanted to avoid toll highways this time, so we decided to try it. Sheila and I were so engrossed in conversation that we didn't realize we were approaching an abandoned town. When I finally noticed our surroundings, I had a horrible feeling in my stomach. My friend noticed and asked if I was okay. "Yes, I'm fine. But this town is pretty creepy," I replied. I wasn't lying. There were old houses with boarded-up windows, closed-down shops, and even abandoned cars and trucks. It honestly looked like something straight out of a horror movie. My friend and I fell silent. You could feel the drastic change in the air. It felt sinister. A couple of minutes passed in silence, and my car began to sputter. I realized we were running out of gas. I'd forgotten to stop for fuel in a town miles back. I pulled over in front of another abandoned house. "What a great place to get stranded," Sheila joked nervously. I nodded in agreement with her sarcastic comment. I took out my phone and tried to call roadside assistance, which my parents had pre-programmed into my phone. That's when I realized we had no signal. I got out of the car and Sheila followed me. That's when things started to get really strange and terrifying. I was completely focused on trying to get reception when I noticed Sheila staring straight ahead, looking terrified. She whispered my name and grabbed my shirt, then pointed forward. "There's a man standing about 10 feet away from us," she whispered. I followed her gaze, and she was right. There was a man about 6'3", almost 6'6", standing in front of my car's headlights. How could someone even be here? This place is a dead town, I thought. He wasn't breathing or speaking, and my heart was in my stomach. Finally, Sheila spoke. "Do you need something?" she called out. At that moment, he tilted his head and grinned widely, which scared us even more. I was so terrified that I couldn't even move. He just stood there, smiling at us. "My dad is a cop, you idiot," Sheila shouted. That was a big mistake on her part because his expression changed to anger, and he started moving toward us very quickly. Our adrenaline kicked in, and we ran back to the car, locking the doors. We looked up, but he was gone. We sat there confused for a moment until we heard a noise coming from underneath the car. I was breathing so heavily that it distracted me from the sound. He was under my car. Sheila was screaming, tears streaming down her face, while I was trying to stay calm, just hoping my phone would get a signal. Finally, I got 2 bars. I called the police and explained what was happening. They said they would arrive in 20 minutes. 20 minutes felt like an eternity under the circumstances, but we were in the middle of nowhere, so it was what it was. When the call ended, the noise stopped. I was still on high alert, scared out of my mind. I hugged Sheila and we both cried. Her face turned blank as she looked behind me, toward the back window. My gut told me not to look, but I couldn't help it. That man and 4 other people, 2 more men and 2 women, were standing behind our car. My heart dropped again. They were all smiling at us in a very unsettling way. At that moment, I started to hear police sirens and sighed in relief. Sheila and I looked forward and saw a police car approaching. I'd never been so happy to see an officer. When they pulled up to our car, The people had vanished. I was so shaken that I couldn't even explain to the officers what had happened. Sheila did it for me. They offered to bring us some gas, but I begged them to take us to a hotel in a very populated area and call my parents to come pick us up. To this day, the police never found those people, and we never figured out where they could have come from. I guess they lived in one of the abandoned buildings. I hope that one day they block off that town. I'm never taking that route again. Story 7. This happened just a few days ago while I was on a road trip with my cousin Javier. I was 13 years old, and Javier was 21. I had a great relationship with my cousin, so my parents would let me go on trips with him from time to time. It was a 10-hour drive, and we were 3 hours into the trip. It was 9 p.m., and I was pretty tired. Everything seemed hilarious at that point. So when I saw a red truck outside my window, I just started laughing. The man in the truck was quite large, to say the least, with a long, unkempt beard. He gave off a creepy vibe, but I waved at him anyway. In response, he made a groping gesture toward me. I found it more hilarious than creepy, so I laughed even harder and told Javier about it, mimicking the groping motion. Javier looked disgusted and upset, but there wasn't much we could do about it. A while later, about 4.5 hours into the drive, Javier stopped at a rest area. I went into the bathroom, and when I came out, the man was standing there. He looked at least 6 feet tall. I glanced through the glass door leading into the building and saw Javier glaring at me angrily through it. I was confused and went back to the car. What he told me really scared me, so much so that I started crying, even though I'd been awake for over 20 hours. Javier said the man had been watching me and followed me into the building, muttering to himself. According to Javier, he wasn't exactly whispering. He was basically speaking normally. He tried to comfort me, but quickly said he needed to use the bathroom and went inside. A few seconds later, while I was still in the car, the man appeared at my window. He stared at me again with a wide, creepy smile. He started saying that I should go with him and that he'd treat me very well. He offered me candy and tried to coax me into getting into his truck. I was busy crying, but right then, Javier came out and shouted at the man, threatening him. The man backed off and returned to his truck, but he kept looking at me with that smile on his face. We drove off, wanting nothing more to do with him. It was around midnight when we arrived at a motel to sleep for the night. Everything was fine until 8 a.m. The next morning, we were at a restaurant having breakfast when the same man sat down at a table near us. He smiled at me, and I looked at Javier, who was about to explode with anger. As the man passed our table on his way to the bathroom, he ran his hand across my shoulder. He did the same thing on his way back. It was definitely not accidental. Both Javier and I knew that. Javier is a laid-back guy who lets most things slide, but he's very protective of me since he's known me since I was a baby. This isn't the case with my other siblings. He and I are especially close. He was already angry before, but at this point, he stood up from his seat and walked over to the man's table. He started yelling at him to stop following us and leave us alone. He didn't make any direct threats, but he did curse a lot. I was feeling really nervous and just wanted to leave. The man stood up and punched Javier, then shouted that I had provoked him. Keep in mind, I was 12 years old at the time. Their argument escalated, and the police arrived to break it up. After hearing the story, the officers said that because Javier had been assaulted, we could press charges. Javier decided not to, and we continued our day. The rest of the trip was fairly uneventful. We didn't see the man again. However, Javier stuck to me like a bodyguard everywhere we went. Even though he was protecting me, I was still scared. Story 8. I'm 14 years old and very small. Barely 5 feet 2 inches tall and weighing about 128 pounds. I look younger than I really am. This happened a month ago when I was moving. After loading up the moving truck, I fell asleep inside. An hour or two later, we were in a town near my new home. My grandmother was parked in the Burger King parking lot, and I was still asleep. My 19-year-old cousin, let's call him Maximiliano, came to the passenger door and woke me up to help carry the food. I agreed, and we went inside the Burger King. She placed her order, and I tapped her arm to let her know I was going to the restroom. When I finished and came out, I noticed an older man, probably in his 50s or 60s, staring at Maximiliano and then at me. I didn't pay much attention because I was still sleepy. I walked over to Maximiliano while she was trying to get soda from one of the machines. After a while, she finally got it and we left Burger King. As I sat in the moving truck, drinking my chocolate milkshake, I saw the man walking toward the truck. He said, "I know who you are," and stopped on the driver's side where my grandmother was sitting. She seemed confused and responded, "Who am I?" He said in the same tone, "The woman of God," and then began rambling about taking care of us girls. Meanwhile, I was terrified. Ideas from creepy stories I'd read on Reddit started running through my mind. Suddenly, he pointed at me with a completely serious expression and said, "You're a nuisance." At that moment, I felt really confused and scared, so I awkwardly laughed and mumbled something. He kept rambling until I heard Maximiliano call my name, saying I had left my fries in the bag. But I already had my fries. I walked over to ask what she meant, but she changed the subject to the man. About 5 minutes later, we agreed that he was giving off creepy vibes. However, my grandmother called my name, letting me know we were leaving. The old man's car was blocking our way at that point, so he got in and moved it to let us through. He made the "I'm watching you" gesture with his fingers and mouthed the words, "I'm watching you." That's when I grabbed my phone and called Maximiliano. I told him to make sure the man wasn't following us. Fortunately, he didn't. It still gives me chills to think about how he was watching us the entire time we were ordering our food and drinks. Story 9. To understand the magnitude of this story, you first need to know who I am. So here's a bit of context. I was born in 1954. So I spent my formative years growing up under the influence of the 1960s and early 1970s in a very small town in northern Mexico. When I say small, I mean there was only one traffic light at the main street intersection. There were about 40 businesses in the town center: a pharmacy, a grocery store, a hardware store, a stationery shop, a convenience store, a gas station, and a barber shop. We had churches of various denominations, and most people attended one weekly. We also had a library, a post office, and a police station. The police station was organized in such a way that you could easily walk past the officer at the desk. 9 out of 10 times, you could go in and see if anyone was in the cell. If there was someone, we'd deliver messages to them, fetch cigarettes, or whatever they needed. We never bothered to ask why they were there. I was a curious child of free spirit and completely innocent. A little later came Kennedy's assassination, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War protests, and the hippie revolution, which I joined, becoming one of the first hippies. During those years, hitchhiking was common, so I did it a lot. For just over 3 years, I took many trips all over Mexico, much to my mother's dismay. Sometimes I went with friends, sometimes alone, always without money, without extra clothes, and without worries. Many people tried to warn me about the dangers, but being very young and naive and feeling completely invincible, I ignored all their well-meaning advice. This wasn't my first trip, nor was it my last, but it was the most memorable, and you'll understand just how close I came to great danger. It was June 1969. I was 14 years old and spending the night at my friend Dina's house, who lived in a nearby town. I convinced her to come with me to Mexico City. It turned out she had a brother living there whom she hadn't seen in a while. So, we headed through the countryside toward the highway and stuck out our thumbs. It never took long to get a ride. As you might imagine, we caught many rides. A bus picked us up on its way to a concert in Guadalajara. We didn't want to make that big detour, so we passed. I don't remember which band it was. I do remember another ride where we got into a car with 4 people and went to a party in a popular neighborhood in Mexico City. We were the only people from our small town at that party, and let me tell you, we had a lot of fun. I never felt unwanted or in danger. In fact, the kind lady who lived in that apartment gave me a shirt, which I thought was very kind. Now, as an adult, I realized she was trying to cover me up. God bless her. The next ride went pretty well until we picked up another hitchhiker. He was a lonely guy who wouldn't stop pestering the driver about how much trouble he'd get into if he got caught driving 2 underage girls across state lines. I got really irritated and told him to shut up. We should have gotten out right then and there, but we didn't. He wasn't dangerous, just annoying. The driver stopped to refuel at a gas station in the state of Mexico, and Dina and I went to the restroom to freshen up. When we came back out, the police were waiting outside, and we ended up at the station. I'm sure our parents were contacted immediately, though I don't remember that part. We were quite the attraction at the small police station. Officers came to talk to us and play cards. They brought us cigarettes, sweets, and donuts. I don't think we were there long before Dina's mom came to pick us up, and after talking to her daughter, she decided to drive us the rest of the way to Mexico City, which was just over 1,200 miles away. Incredible. I remember us singing along to the radio all the way to Guadalajara. I especially remember the song, Are You Going to San Francisco? By Mama and Papa. Later, we checked into a hotel in Guadalajara. It was so boring there, not what I'd signed up for. I tried to convince Dina to leave with me, but now as an adult, I realize how awful and selfish that would have been, and how devastating it would have been for her mom. Luckily for everyone, she refused to go, so I stayed. Finally, we made it to Mexico City, right in the historic center near the university, where all the hippie action was. But we had Mom following us. It was all so overwhelming for me. I was pretty cool for our small town, but this was out of my league. As I mentioned before, I was very naive and not fully aware of things like drug addiction. But I saw it firsthand in a nearby park. Seeing everyone high scared me so much. I also saw other things I can't mention. That said, I was in shock. I wanted to go home, and I've never wanted to return to Mexico City since. To this day, I don't remember how many weeks I was gone on that particular adventure, but shortly after, I was back home, watching TV with my mom. It was July, and the news was talking about the Manson family and the infamous murders. That's when I realized how close I had been to being picked up by them and possibly becoming part of the family. What if I had left alone that night and hadn't stayed with Dina and her mom? Hitchhiking alone through the desert, 9 hours away from an isolated ranch. What if that guy hadn't reported us to the police? Then we would have been there, just the 2 of us, and one or both of us likely would have been picked up by one of them. Later, I learned that the Manson family was actively recruiting people in Mexico City, where we were. Every day, I'm thankful I didn't get involved in that. Back then, I was prime material to be chosen, especially if they caught me before arriving. Story 10. I vividly remember those nights, even though it's been more than 12 years. I was a teenager, hanging out with some friends at one of their houses. We were just playing video games and joking around, as teenagers do. But as the night went on, it was time for everyone to head home. It was my turn to drive. I had brought my mom's beautiful minivan for the occasion, and my favorite part was looking cool while driving it. I even wore some stylish sunglasses. Even though it was nighttime, I was happy to help out, and it gave me the chance to spend a little extra time with my friends. The first 3 friends were dropped off without incident, but then it was time to head to Alton's house. I knew Alton lived in a remote area, but I had no idea how far it was because I had never been there before. We drove along a long, winding gravel road, surrounded by forest on both sides. It was so dark that I could barely see the road in front of us. I drove slowly because I could only see as far as my headlights reached, and even with the high beams on, it wasn't very far. After what felt like a long time, we finally reached Alton's house. It was a small, simple home hidden in the woods. He thanked me and jumped out of the minivan. Then I turned around and started the long drive back. I was nervous about the return trip, mainly because it was so dark and isolated. I made sure to pay attention to all the turns on the way in so I wouldn't get lost. I repeated the turns in my head several times and felt pretty confident I'd remember them. I was about halfway back to the main road when something caught my attention. There was a man standing on the side of the road, just standing there. At first, I thought he was a hitchhiker, which was strange because there was very little traffic at that hour. But as I got closer, he disappeared into the forest. I remember feeling really scared and confused. I wasn't sure what to think, but I knew it wasn't normal. I knew there were other houses in the area, but they were few and far between, so it didn't make sense for someone to be walking there, especially at night. I finally got home and tried to forget about the strange man in the forest. I told myself it was probably just a local taking a late-night walk, as unlikely as that sounded. However, it wasn't until the next day that I heard about something terrible that had happened. I was hanging out with my friends again and told them what I had seen in the forest that night. But then someone mentioned that one of Alton's neighbors had gone missing that night. I listened in fear as they kept talking. I was sure it had to be connected to what I had seen. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Was it possible that the strange man I saw on the road was actually involved in the disappearance? The thought sent chills down my spine. We called the police right then and there. I told them I had been in the area and saw a strange man on the road in the middle of the night. The police asked me to come to the station. I went and gave a more detailed account of what I saw that night and what had happened before that. I tried to get more information about the case because I was curious, but they told me it was confidential. Well, I suppose that's fair. As the days went by, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. I replayed the events in my mind, wondering if there was something I could have done differently. But in the end, there really wasn't anything I could have done. What could I have done? Stopped my car and chased a man into the forest in the dark? The police combed through the forest for days, paying particular attention to the area where I saw the man, but nothing was found, and Alton's neighbor never returned. After a few years, I almost forgot about the whole situation. The case must have gone cold because I hadn't heard anything about it in a long time. That was until one day, when I was watching the news. The body of Alton's neighbor was finally discovered, but it wasn't the area where I saw the man. It was in a different section of the forest, more than 50 meters away. I still can't help but think about that night and wonder if it was really him I saw on the road. I wonder if he moved the body to a different location because he knew I had seen it. There's no way to be sure, but I believe something bad was happening on those roads that night. Something very bad. Story 11. This happened on a warm night in Sonora in September 2013. I noticed a full moon as I drove down a deserted road. My headlights cut through the dense fog that had settled over the city. I had just finished a long shift at the hospital and was looking forward to a quiet night at home. But fate had other plans for me. As I turned a curve in the road, I saw 2 cars stopped on the shoulder, illuminated by the glow of a streetlight. As I got closer, I saw a man being held at gunpoint by another man. I slowed down as I passed. The victim was trembling and pleading with the assailant, but he was relentless in his demands for money and valuables. At first, they didn't even seem to notice me, perhaps because all the commotion was enough of a distraction for me to go unnoticed. My hands started trembling on the steering wheel as I realized I was witnessing a crime in progress. I knew I had to act quickly, so I backed my car into a dark section of the road and searched my pocket for my phone. I dropped it on the floor of my car, my eyes still fixed on the robbery. I bent down to pick up my phone, not wanting to look away. Finally, I found it and dialed 911, then watched in horror as the assailant turned toward me. Until then, I thought I was safely hidden in the darkness, but I was wrong. I pressed the accelerator quickly and drove away, praying he wouldn't follow me. I drove for several minutes, my hands trembling on the wheel as I replayed what I had just seen. Finally, I stopped on the side of the road and my phone rang. It was the police. I wasn't sure how long they'd been on the line, but I figured all they would have heard from me was heavy breathing and maybe a few curse words. When I answered, the officer told me that someone was on the way and would arrive soon. I breathed a sigh of relief as I hung up, knowing I had done the right thing by calling for help. But as I sat in the car waiting for the police to arrive, I noticed another car pulling up behind me. At first, I thought it was the assailant because the car looked like one of the ones I had seen earlier. Then I realized it was just another driver, probably curious about what was happening. As the minutes passed, I started to feel uneasy. The driver of the other car had gotten out and was pacing back and forth behind his vehicle as if waiting for something. I started to think I had been wrong and that maybe he was the assailant after all. My instincts told me something wasn't right, so I locked the doors and watched him closely. Just as I was about to call the police again, I saw flashing lights in the distance. Finally, the cavalry had arrived, and I felt relieved to see 2 police cars pulling up behind me. The other guy didn't leave. I thought that if he were the assailant, he would have driven off by now, so I felt a little more relaxed. But if he wasn't the assailant, then who was he? One of the officers approached my car. We talked for a few minutes about what was happening. He told me to stay in my car and walked away. Both officers approached the other driver, who had stopped pacing and was now standing silently next to his car. I watched through the rearview mirror as both officers got closer to him. Suddenly, the driver bolted and ran into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. The officers chased him, but he was too fast and elusive. For several hours, the police searched the area for the driver, combing through the woods and checking nearby houses, but he had vanished without a trace, leaving only more questions. The next day, I received a call from the police saying they had identified the driver and that he had a long criminal history. They thanked me for reporting the crime and for being observant, which had helped them catch a dangerous criminal. His behavior still confuses me. What was he thinking by following me to that location? And why hadn't he left as soon as the police arrived? Maybe he was under the influence of something, or maybe he just wasn't very smart. In the weeks that followed, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened that night. I knew I had done the right thing by calling the police, but I also knew I had put myself in danger by getting involved at all. Despite the risks, I would do it again without hesitation. There really wasn't a choice. What would you do if you saw someone being robbed? Story 12. I am a taxi driver, and I have been doing this job for over 10 years. This happened nearly 4 years ago. I've seen it all, from drunk and rowdy passengers to quiet and reserved ones. But nothing could have prepared me for the night I picked up a passenger who would change my life forever. It was a cold night, one of those that make you want to stay home and curl up under a blanket. But duty called, and I had work to do. I was driving my taxi around the city, looking for my next passenger, when I saw him standing on the corner. He was a tall man dressed in a dark suit, with his hands in his pockets. He pulled one hand out and signaled for me to stop. He opened the back door and got in, closing it behind him. I could see he was a bit nervous, glancing around the car like he was searching for something. I greeted him, and he responded with a nod. Where to? I asked. He gave me an address on the other side of the city. I shifted the car into gear, and we set off. I tried to make small talk to break the ice. He was polite but distant, answering my questions with just a few words. As we drove, he suddenly changed his mind and asked me to take him to a different address. I followed his directions and ended up on a dark, deserted street. He then asked me to stop in front of an old building. It looked abandoned, so I wasn't sure what he could want there. I hesitated for a moment, but he assured me it was safe. When we parked, he got out and told me to wait for him. I watched as he approached another man on the street. They exchanged a few words. The other man looked intimidating, with a shaved head and lots of tattoos, which sharply contrasted with my passenger, who looked like a businessman. I was about to drive off, but just in time, my passenger returned to the car. The intimidating man followed him, and both got into the back seat. Then my passenger told me to drive, and so I did. I felt uneasy about the situation, but I couldn't refuse. As we drove, the passenger and the intimidating man spoke in hushed tones. I could only catch a few words, but I started to suspect I was being used in a crime. My heart began to race. I knew I had to do something to protect myself. The smartest thing was probably to go along with whatever they were planning, and then call the police afterward. However, I knew there was a police station just a few blocks away. It was a snap decision, but I made it. I took the turn and pressed the accelerator. As we approached the station, the passenger suddenly pulled out a gun and pointed it at me. "Don't even think about it," he said. "Keep driving." By then, it was too late. We were right in front of the police station. I stopped the car, and both men got out and ran. I was in shock, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. After catching my breath, I walked into the station and told the police what had just happened. I still didn't know what those guys were planning, but one of them had pointed a gun at me. I described the men as best as I could, but then I learned that they had been caught on the police station security cameras. We had been so close. The next day, the police called me and asked me to come to the station for an interview. They had captured the two men and wanted me to identify them. I went to the station and was shown a lineup of suspects. I recognized the passenger immediately. I pointed him out to the police. He was arrested and charged with attempted robbery and assault. The intimidating man was also arrested, and they found a weapon on him that linked him to other crimes. I felt relieved knowing they were no longer on the streets and couldn't cause more harm. Over time, the memory of that night began to fade, and I returned to my routine. I've had some other scary experiences over the years, and maybe I'll share those someday, but this one was definitely the worst. Story 13. The scariest thing happened when I was about 10 or 11 years old, and my family took a trip to Mexico to visit my grandparents. They lived in a small village right on the Pacific coast, where the weather was warm and the beaches were beautiful. I always looked forward to these trips because I lived in the north, where the weather wasn't great year-round. We always went in March, during the week my brother and I had off from school. We would leave early in the morning, long before the sun even thought about rising. My dad would do most of the driving, but my mom would take over occasionally so my dad could rest. The trip was long, and we always did it in one go, with my dad driving through the night. We made sure to stop from time to time to stretch our legs and grab something to eat. One of our stops was at a local restaurant, which we thought would be a quick and easy meal. While we were in line, a man started yelling at my dad, accusing him of cutting in line. My dad tried to explain that he hadn't, but the man wouldn't listen. My mom tried to calm the situation, but the man was too angry. I remember feeling scared and wanting to hide, but my dad stayed calm and didn't respond to the man's aggression. After we finished eating, we got back in the car and hit the road again. However, we soon realized that the man from the restaurant was following us. We ignored him for a while, hoping he would turn off in another direction, but he kept following us. I watched him from the back window, and it made me feel really scared. My mom asked my dad what we should do. He told her to ignore him and that he'd get bored eventually. Suddenly, the man rear-ended our car. The impact caused our car to swerve. My brother started crying. My parents quickly realized we needed to call the police. My mom dialed 911 and calmly explained to the operator what was happening. Her voice was steady, even though I knew she was forcing it for the sake of my brother and me. After just a few minutes, we started hearing sirens and saw a police car approaching from behind. We pulled over to the side of the road, and the other car drove past us. The police car chased after the other vehicle while we waited inside. Another police car pulled up behind us, and the officer came over to our car. He told us they had arrested the man. Story 14. I work as a truck driver. It was an April afternoon, and my eyes were scanning the road ahead of me. In my job, I've seen my fair share of strange things on the road, but that day, something felt different. The sun was high in the sky, and the air was thick with humidity. It had been a day or two since I'd really spoken to anyone, and my loneliness was becoming hard to bear. That's when I saw her, a young woman with long, curly hair, holding out her thumb in a desperate attempt to hitchhike. She wore blue jeans and a red hoodie, with a small single-strap backpack slung over her right shoulder. I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road, then rolled down my window. "Need a ride?" I asked. She nodded and climbed into the cab of my truck, her eyes nervously glancing behind her. She seemed uneasy. At the time, I thought maybe she was just new to hitchhiking. I'm not intimidating at all, but I understood her nervousness since I was still a stranger. She seemed agitated and kept looking out the window, as if she expected someone to jump out at any moment. As we drove, I noticed a car behind us. It was a police car, but its lights weren't on, so I didn't think much of it. Just then, I heard a siren and saw the flashing lights. I was being pulled over. I stopped immediately. At that moment, I thought I was in trouble for picking up a hitchhiker, which is technically illegal where I live. I brought my truck to a halt and waited for the officer to approach. To my surprise, when the officer came to the truck, he demanded that the woman step out. When she got out, I saw her hands trembling and her face red with distress. I watched in confusion as the officer handcuffed her and escorted her to the patrol car. It wasn't until I heard the radio chatter reporting a robbery at a nearby rest stop that I realized what had happened. She had robbed a store and was using my truck as her getaway vehicle. The officer placed her in the back of the patrol car and then came over to speak with me. He told me I shouldn't pick up hitchhikers, but he only gave me a warning and no ticket. I was a bit shaken by the experience, but it didn't seem that bad. The truly terrifying part came later, when I heard the full story on the news. It turned out that the woman had shot a man during the robbery. She had the gun in her backpack while she was in my truck. Until then, it had been a good story for parties, but after learning this, it really scared me. Story 15. That night, the wind whispered sinister secrets as I drove home after a long day at work. The streets were deserted, and darkness wrapped around my car like an icy blanket. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel, but I tried to stay calm, focused on getting home safely. Suddenly, I noticed bright lights behind me, an ominous presence in my rearview mirror. At first, I thought it was just another late-night driver. But soon I realized this vehicle was mimicking my every move, like a predator stalking its prey. Fear gripped me as the car got closer, its high beams flooding my mirror, momentarily blinding me. I tried to keep my composure, but my heart pounded in my chest like a drum announcing imminent danger. I sped up, trying to lose the pursuer in the shadows of the night, but they seemed to anticipate my every turn and every alley. My breath was short, and cold sweat drenched my back. I felt trapped in a never-ending nightmare. I tried calling the police, but my hands were trembling so much that I could barely dial the emergency number. The operator's voice sounded distant and distorted, as if they were speaking from another world. Time seemed to stretch, each second feeling endless as the pursuer relentlessly continued their implacable chase. My thoughts became clouded, filled with panic and desperation, as I struggled to maintain control over my fate. Finally, I reached a dead-end street, cornered like prey surrounded by its predator. The pursuer's car stopped behind me, its headlights cutting through the night with a cold and cruel light. I knew there was no escape. With my heart in my throat, I stepped out of my car, trembling so much that my legs could barely hold me. The sound of slow, deliberate footsteps echoed in the air, drawing closer and closer. Then, out of the darkness, the pursuer emerged, their face hidden beneath a dark hood. Their eyes glowed with an unfathomable malice, filled with a sinister desire that froze my blood in my veins. Terror consumed me when I realized the pursuer wasn't a stranger. It was someone I knew far too well, an old acquaintance whose obsession had grown into a living nightmare. My final scream of horror got caught in my throat as the pursuer lunged at me, their dark figure enveloped in the unending night. In that moment, I knew my fight was just beginning, that the nightmare would never end as long as they continued to stalk me from the shadows.